They laughed when she barked. They forgot her name. They wrote her off as a punchline. But what they didn't know was that behind that bark stood a woman battling cancer, colorism, and a cruel industry that tried to erase her. And now, 67 Vanessa Bell Calloway is coming back with a roar so loud, Hollywood has no choice but to listen. This isn't a comeback. It's a reckoning. Most people remember Vanessa Bell Calloway as the obedient, barking bride from Coming to America character, who literally bowed, barked, and vanished into film history. But what if that moment wasn't her legacy, but just the beginning? 2025, at 67 years old. Vanessa isn't just revisiting the spotlight, she's completely redefining it. After quietly enduring a private health battle, she's emerged, not weakened, but transformed. Hollywood has long had a habit of overlooking women like her graceful, gifted, and aging on their own terms, but Vanessa is breaking that mold. No longer content to play by outdated rules. She's taking charge of her narrative and rewriting it with power, dignity, and fierce intention. What she's accomplished this year isn't just impressive, and for those who only saw her as the woman who barked on cue, they're about to see a version of Vanessa they never expected, one who commands the room without ever having to ask permission. It was a scene designed to make audiences laugh, a woman barking on command, a punchline in royal clothing. But behind that unforgettable moment in Coming to America stood Vanessa Bell Calloway, a woman who had far more to say than the industry ever allowed her to. Fast forward to 2025, and Vanessa isn't just making a comeback, she's commanding the room with the power of a woman who refused to be forgotten. Today, she's lighting up red carpets with the kind of poise only a woman who's walked through fire can carry. Her latest role, a raw, emotionally charged performances, already being hailed by critics as the defining work of her career. Not because it's flashy, but because it's honest. It's layered. It's her. And now, after decades of quiet resilience, Vanessa Bell Calloway isn't trending for controversy or clickbait. She's making headlines for something far more powerful: her strength. But what most fans don't realize is that this return to the spotlight wasn't sudden. It didn't happen because of luck or timing. It was built over years of being overlooked, undercast, and underestimated. It came after long battles behind the scenes, fighting to be seen as more than a stereotype, struggling against an industry that valued her beauty but often ignored her depth, and facing a private health scare that could have taken it all away. This moment isn't just a comeback, it's a reclamation. It's about reclaiming her time, her narrative, her identity. For too long, Vanessa was placed in the background of stories that weren't written for women like her. Now, she's stepping into center stage on her own terms. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain and finally giving her the spotlight she has more than earned. This is the story of Vanessa Bell Calloway, the survivor, the fighter, the quiet force who turned decades of rejection into a career defined by courage. It's time to hear her voice, her truth, and her version of a legacy that was never lost, only waiting to be claimed. Because yes, someone did try to block her return. And yes, her new interview just dropped a bombshell about Eddie Murphy and a sequel experience that nearly broke her spirit. But beyond the headlines, there's something even more profound happening in Vanessa's life right now. Something that could permanently shift how we see her legacy. Before she was the princess hopping on one foot in a comedic crown, Vanessa Bell Calloway was a theater kid with Broadway dreams. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, her journey began not in front of movie cameras but under stage lights. She trained with the legendary Alvin Ailey in dance and pursued acting with the seriousness of someone chasing mastery, not fame. Vanessa wasn't chasing stardom, she was chasing excellence. By the mid-1980s, she was landing TV and film roles, small but meaningful. Then came 1988. Coming to America exploded into pop culture, and Vanessa's, seen as the overly obedient bride, became iconic. Audiences laughed, critics cheered, and just like that, Vanessa's face was everywhere, but her name remained elusive. The scene had been unforgettable, but it also came with an invisible price tag: limitation. Casting directors didn't see the classically trained actress, they saw the joke. Suddenly, she was boxed into roles as the sassy sidekick, the mysterious beauty, or the background ornament. Eddie Murphy's star soared, while Vanessa's talents were quietly sidelined, not because she lacked skill, but because her brilliance in a single comedic moment became a ceiling she couldn't shake. In later interviews, Vanessa revealed she had actually auditioned for the lead role of Lisa McDowell, the romantic heart of the story. She didn't get it. Instead, she was offered the smaller part, and like many black actresses in the 80s, she didn't feel she could say no. Opportunity was rare, and turning down a role could mean not being asked again. So, she said yes and gave it everything. What she didn't know was that this role, while beloved by audiences, would shadow her for years to come. What people rarely saw, though, was the struggle behind the scenes. Vanessa wanted to be seen, not just noticed. She wanted roles with weight, not just presence. Over the years, she quietly built a steady career. Shameless, The Temptations, What's Love Got to Do with It? Saints and Sinners, a catalog of work that showcased her range. She was always working, but rarely celebrated, the way she deserved. And then came a storm no camera caught. In 2009, during one of her busiest career stretches, Vanessa began to feel off, fatigued, unsettled. At first, she chalked it up to stress or aging. After all, she was balancing the demands of motherhood, marriage, and an unpredictable industry. But deep inside, she knew something was wrong. Then came the diagnosis. Stage 0 breast cancer, ductal carcinoma, insidious, a non-invasive but serious early form of cancer. It was a quiet intruder, arriving without warning, without family history, and despite a lifestyle rooted in health and moderation, the word cancer itself hit like a wrecking ball, shattering the illusion of control she'd spent decades protecting. And yet, she didn't fall apart. Vanessa faced the illness the same way she faced Hollywood's rejection, with grace, grit, and an unwavering will to survive. She kept going, even when the spotlight dimmed, even when the world forgot. And now, in 2025, she's no longer asking for a seat at the table, she's building her own. Because what Vanessa Bell Calloway is doing right now isn't just about a role or a comeback, it's a legacy in the making, one born not from luck, but from the relentless pursuit of purpose in a world that tried to define her too soon. There she was, facing something most of us spend our lives trying not to think about, her own mortality. But instead of making it public, instead of leaning into pity or posting cryptic captions, Vanessa Bell Calloway chose silence. Not the silence of denial, but of quiet strength. When she was diagnosed with stage 0 breast cancer, she didn't alert the press or share her battle online. She didn't pause her career or ask the world to watch her fight. She kept moving forward, even as her body bore the weight of major surgery, a mastectomy, and breast reconstruction in 2010. Imagine that. Performing on stage, walking red carpets, laughing in interviews while privately nursing pain, fear, and the deep uncertainty of what the future might hold. She was holding it all together while everything inside her was being reshaped physically and emotionally. That wasn't hiding. That was surviving. That was power. Years later, Vanessa would finally speak about that time, explaining her decision, with a raw honesty few in Hollywood dare to show. "I didn't want to be seen as weak," she admitted. Not because she was ashamed, but because she knew the industry she was in. Vulnerability, especially for Black women in entertainment, is too often seen, not as courage but as a risk. Her silence wasn't pride. It was protection. But even in private, her experience changed her. Cancer didn't just test her body, it recalibrated her soul. She began speaking out about women's health, particularly in Black communities where delayed diagnoses and medical neglect are tragically common. Vanessa became an advocate, not with loud campaigns, but with unwavering purpose. Slowly, people stopped seeing her as just the barking bride from Coming to America. They began seeing her for who she really was, a survivor, a fighter, and a woman who had rebuilt herself one decision at a time. Still, you'd think coming back from cancer would have earned her a red carpet welcome in the town she'd dedicated her life to. But Hollywood had other plans. After her recovery, Vanessa felt reborn, more grounded, more present, more ready than ever to take on powerful, meaningful roles. But the industry didn't meet her with opportunity. It met her with silence. The roles she was offered weren't reflective of her journey. They were hollow caricatures, flimsy outlines of womanhood, with none of the soul, none of the substance, and certainly none of the scars she had earned. They wanted her to play the troubled mother, always angry, always weary, always holding back tears for someone else's redemption arc, or the feisty neighbor, the one with the loud opinions and snappy comebacks, there for comic relief, never for the heart of the story. Or worse, the silent churchgoer sitting in the background, nodding quietly, offering gospel wisdom in one scene, and disappearing in the next. These roles weren't roles, they were shadows. Nothing about them captured the gravity of what she had lived through, fought through, or overcome. Nothing honored the complexity of her years in the industry, or the depth of a woman who had seen her fair share of both red carpets and hospital beds. standing ovations and private heartbreak, and then came the quiet dismissal, the kind Hollywood specializes in, not with cruelty, but with condescension. They told her she was too old. Too old to fall in love on screen. Too old to carry a story. Too old to be desirable, magnetic, or emotionally complex. She wasn't being offered mature love stories, or roles that embraced the nuances of aging. No, she was being filtered out, tucked away behind younger actresses as the wise auntie, the grieving mother, the spiritual advisor. In every script, she was merely scaffolding supporting the rise of someone else's storyline. The insult wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Because while she was being gently ushered off the stage, her male peersmen she had acted alongside for decades were still being cast as romantic leads. Men in their 60s and 70s were romancing actresses in their 30s and 40s, given full narrative arcs that allowed them to be vulnerable, funny, heroic, sexy. No one told them they were too old. No one questioned their ability to carry a film. They were allowed to age into gravitas, into silver-haired desirability, into deeper complexity. But for her, age was treated like a liability, not a badge of survival. The hypocrisy was glaring and painful. And here stood Vanessa Bell Calloway, a woman with a resume that could humble a room, being told, without hesitation, that her time had passed. A classically trained dancer, she had once performed with Alvin Ailey's legendary dance theater, her body a vessel of rhythm and expression. On Broadway, her voice and presence commanded attention, breathing life into stories that pulsed with urgency and passion. On television, she became a household name, appearing in dozens of shows, often elevating roles far beneath her capability, simply through presence, poise, and professionalism. She had survived an industry that routinely devoured Black women, especially those who dared to age and beyond the lights and cameras. She had lived, truly lived. She battled breast cancer with grace and grit, going public not for attention, but to advocate for early detection and survival. She mothered children, built a marriage, weathered storms, both public and private. She had known joy and betrayal, abundance and silence, faith and doubt. She didn't just ACTI, she embodied experience. So when casting directors reduced her to tropes, when networks politely declined to center her in their narratives, when scripts forgot that Black women over 60 still dream, still love, wasn't just insulting, it was violent in its erasure. Because Vanessa wasn't asking for favors, she wasn't begging to belong. She was simply asking to be seen fully, truthfully, without distortion. She knew she still had stories to tell, important ones, not just about age, but about resilience, joy, legacy, and love. Stories that didn't cater to trends but dared to challenge the industry's narrow lens. She wasn't interested in clinging to youth or pretending to be 40 again. She was 67, and radiant, and ready. The industry's refusal to embrace older Black women wasn't just short-sighted, was cowardly. Because if it truly looked at someone like Vanessa Bell Calloway, it would have to confront its own bias. It would have to admit that its definition of leading lady was rooted not in talent or truth, but in fantasy and fear. It would have to dismantle the myth that women become invisible with age, especially Black women, whose visibility was already fragile to begin with. But Vanessa refused to disappear. She refused to shrink. She had seen too much, survived too much, and meant too much to let anyone reduce her to background noise. She began producing her own work, taking back the pen, curating stories where women like her were not only visible, but vital. She leaned into her power, not the performative kind, but the quiet, unshakable kind that comes from enduring and choosing to keep showing up anyway. And perhaps that was the most revolutionary thing she could do. To age unapologetically in an industry obsessed with reinvention. To demand dignity when others offered nostalgia. To carry her story not as a burden, but as a torch. Because her time hadn't passed. But Vanessa didn't retreat. She created her own space. She wrote and performed a one-woman stage show called Letters from Zora, bringing the words and wisdom of legendary writer Zora Neale Hurston to life. It wasn't just a performance, it was a declaration. A message to the industry that her voice was still strong, her talent still boundless, and her story far from over. Vanessa Bell Calloway was done waiting for permission. She wasn't fading, she was evolving. And that is what the world is finally starting to see. She turned to indie films, Black theater, and television guest roles, not because they paid the most or brought red carpet fame, but because they were the only places that allowed her to exist beyond a stereotype. And even in those spaces, Vanessa Calloway often found herself emotionally exhausted, tired of asking to be seen. Tired of watching less experienced actresses land the roles she'd earned a dozen times over. Tired of breathing life into characters that barely existed on the page. Still, she showed up. Still, she gave her all. In interviews, she once said, "They don't write stories for women like me." And that wasn't bitterness, it was fact. In an industry obsessed with youth and whiteness, being a dark-skinned black woman over 40 meant fighting for scraps. It was a systemic erasure written into casting calls, budgets, scripts, and magazine covers. Even fans, many of whom adored her, often reduced her to one role, the barking princess from Coming to America. That performance had become both a badge of honor and a cage. Yes, she was grateful. Yes, it made her unforgettable. But she was so much more than that scene. She was a classically trained actress, a cancer survivor, a trailblazer, and for far too long, the industry refused to see it. Then came the sequel. Coming to America was announced, and fans buzzed with excitement, assuming Vanessa would finally be given the screen time and substance she deserved. But when the trailer dropped, it was déjà vu. There she was again, in a lavish gown, silent, barking a callback, not a character. 3 decades later, and the only thing that had changed was the camera lens? Critics and fans alike were outraged. And Vanessa, she smiled, gave polished interviews, but in one conversation, her truth slipped through. She had originally auditioned for the lead role of Lisa McDowell in the 1988 film. She had the talent, the look, the training. But she didn't get it because she was too dark-skinned. That truth hit hard. Not just for her, but for every black woman who'd ever been passed over, overlooked, or told she wasn't the right kind of beautiful. Even in the sequel, where others returned with arcs and dialogue, Vanessa was brought back as a punchline, but she handled it with grace, saying, "I love the character, I love the franchise. I wish it was more, but I showed up and did it with pride." And yet, the injustice was undeniable. After everything she had overcome, after building a legacy of work and advocacy, Hollywood still couldn't offer her the dignity of a fully realized role. But instead of crumbling, Vanessa built her own platform. She returned to the stage with powerful one-woman shows. She advocated for health awareness in underserved communities, and she began speaking openly about colorism, aging, and the reality of being a black woman in a whitewashed industry. When she said, "I didn't get the part because I was too dark," that's just the truth. She wasn't just recounting personal pain, she was exposing a legacy of discrimination that has silenced generations, and she did it without apology. Vanessa Calloway may not have received the roles she deserved, but she carved out a career that cannot be ignored. In a world that tried to shrink her, she stood tall. And perhaps her greatest role has nothing to do with a movie, it's the one she's played in real life, a survivor, a creator, a queen who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. So, the next time someone mentions Coming to America, remember behind that bark was a woman who never stopped roaring.